Lonely rancher, found a child, clutching his mother's cross, then realized who she was. Before we begin, take a moment to comment your city. Where are you tuning in from tonight? And when the story draws to a close, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Now lean back, breathe deep, and let the trail carry you. The wind howled across the Montana prairie, dragging its long fingers of dust and rain over the wide, forsaken land. From somewhere far off, the lonely cry of a harmonica floated through the storm, fading into the steady pound of hooves striking the hard, dry trail. Battered fence posts leaned weary against the night. The rancher's cabin stood alone, braced beneath the weight of thunder and rain. Elias Ward pulled his coat tight against the chill, leading his black horse midnight step by step toward home. Then he stopped. By the old stone well, half hidden in the sweeping sheets of rain, a small figure huddled in the mud. Lightning tore open the sky, and for the briefest instant he saw her face, eyes wide with terror, tiny hands clutching a silver cross pressed to her chest. Elias's breath caught in his throat. The storm seemed to grow heavier, pressing down on his shoulders. Who was this child? And what truth had the night just delivered to his door, the man of silence? On the high plains of Montana in those late years, the prairie stretched wide as a sea of withered gold. The wind tore through broken fence lines, carrying with it the taste of dust and the smell of rain on the horizon. There, a lonely ranch stood, its tin roof weathered by countless storms, a thin ribbon of smoke curling from a crooked chimney. Inside the cabin of rough-hewn logs, Elias Ward sat in silence at a scarred wooden table. The man had lived through nearly 50 winters, yet loss had carved deeper lines into his face than time alone ever could. Once he had been a rancher full of hope, his home filled with the laughter of wife and child. Now only silence remained. On a tin plate before him, a simple supper, cooled untouched. Elias chewed slowly, his eyes drifting toward the empty chair across the table, the place where someone once sat, a place now forever vacant. Outside the barn, his black horse. Midnight gave a soft, heavy snort. The sound carried like a sigh, as if even the animal knew the weight of its master's solitude. The room held the fullness of emptiness, rain pattering on the tin roof, the wind howling through cracks in the door, and the steady ache of a man who had turned away from every bond that once tied him to the world. And so I ask you, if you were living alone on a ranch like this, what would you do? Part 1. The strange rainy night. On the high plains of Montana, rain never falls gentle. It comes down like a whip from the heavens, lashing the skin raw, turning the withered grassland into a sea of shifting mud. Tonight was no different. The sky split apart with thunder lightning clawing across the far ridges of pine, revealing for an instant the figure of a lone man leading his horse toward the ranch. Elias Ward kept his head low, his heavy coat drenched through. Calloused hands gripped the reins, guiding his black horse Midnight as it slogged step by step through the mire. His boots felt like stone. He had weathered 100 nights of rain like this, yet never grew used to the cold that sank into bone. That same cold always pulled him back to the day of his loss, standing beside the graves of his wife and child, rain striking his back as if the storm itself sought to bury his heart alive. All across the prairie lay darkness without a single lantern burning. Only the sound of wind through broken earth, thunder cracking like a rifle overhead, and somewhere far off the sharp echo of a gunshot drifting from the town, a reminder of what the West always demanded: a fight for life. Elias lifted his eyes. A streak of lightning lit them, hollow-tired, watchful, the gaze of a man who had lived by the gun. A herd of cattle broke wild across the plain, driven mad by thunder. They stampeded through the brush hooves, tearing the sod to pieces, flinging mud high into the storm. Midnight reared, snorting hard, but Elias held tight to the reins, whispering calm. And then, faint but clear, a harmonica's wail rose on the wind, drifting lonely through the roar of storm and rain, like the earth itself was crying. Nights in the West hid many things: lost travelers, outlaws in the dark, or the ghosts a man could never outrun. Elias knew all of that. but he never expected fate itself to cross his path this night. On the muddy trail home, there stood an old abandoned well left to ruin for years. Folks said a man once died there digging deep but never finding water. Since that day, the well was forsaken, its stones crumbled, weeds clawing at its sides. To Elias, it was nothing but a scar on the land. He had passed it 100 times without thought. But tonight, through the thick curtain of rain, his eye caught movement. A small shape crouched at the well's edge. Elias stopped cold, his heart stumbling in his chest. "Midnight," he murmured, tugging the reins. The horse froze, snorting, ears pricked sharp. It sensed it too. A bolt of lightning ripped the heavens wide. In that blinding flash, the sight struck Elias like a blade. A child, thin and trembling, clothes in tatters, huddled in the storm. Small arms clutched something bright against its chest. Wide black eyes stared out in terror, flickering like 2 dying flames. Elias could not move. The vision cut him deep, dragging up every buried memory. He had learned to live with silence, to bury the image of his lost child. And yet now, before him, another little one shivered in the rain by the well, as if the ghost of his past had returned. The wind screamed through the stones, whipping the child's soaked hair wild. Thunder rolled so hard the ground itself seemed to split. Elias raised his hand, tried to call out, but his throat locked tight. He had not spoken to a child since that terrible day. Midnight gave a low cry and stepped forward, urging him on. Elias clenched his jaw, forcing his boots through the sucking mud, every step heavier than the last. And then he saw it, the thing the child held so tight. A silver cross gleaming in the lightning. It was an image Elias had seen before, hanging from the neck of the one woman he could never forget. The rain came harder now, pouring as if it meant to wash the earth clean of every trace of man. But the last flash of lightning lingered just long enough for Elias to see it clearly, the silver cross, small and shining, clutched tight in those tiny hands. His heart seized. For years that image had haunted him. His wife, the only woman he had ever truly loved, always wore that cross against her breast. A talisman, she said, would keep them safe. On the day he buried her in the cold ground, Elias had fallen to his knees, broken, because the cross was gone. Lost in that same storm, lost with the wail of the child he could not save. And now here it was, held in the grip of a child he had never seen before. Elias stepped forward, his boots sinking deep into the sucking mud with each step. Midnight snorted, hard mane plastered wet against its neck. The child lifted its face, black eyes trembling with fear and pleading. Don't leave me," the small voice whispered, thin as the wind, yet louder to Elias than thunder itself. He froze. Those eyes, dark, shining in the storm, carried something strange, something familiar, something he once knew, something he once loved. The silver cross blazed in the lightning, cutting through him like a blade. Memory broke open inside his skull, the sound of her laughter beneath the eaves, her fingers brushing the cross in prayer, her voice murmuring, "Elias, if the day ever comes when I am gone, keep this close." But he hadn't. He had lost everything. His lips trembled. He wanted to ask, to cry out, but his throat closed up as if buried beneath the mud. At last, in a voice ragged and raw, he managed, That cross. Where did you get it?" The child only gripped it tighter, silent tears spilling into the rain. Elias staggered a step closer, his hand trembling. The earth seemed to tilt beneath him, as if the storm had unearthed every memory he had tried to bury. Out here on the frontier, a man learned to face gunfire, to watch death come sudden and hard. But the worst pain didn't come from bullets. It came from the past, alive again, sharp as the day it was born. That was the pain breaking Elias Ward tonight. He dropped to his knees, mud rising around his legs. Rain struck the back of his neck like needles, but he couldn't tear his eyes from the child. It shook with cold, clutching the cross, as if it were the only thing holding it back from the dark. Where did you come from?" Elias rasped. The child only shook its head. Lips blew breath, thin and broken. It was fading fast. Elias knew leave it here, and the cold would take it within the hour. Midnight gave a long, sharp cry. ears pitched forward, head tossing toward the cabin in the distance. The horse seemed to urge him as it had done before. Elias drew in a hard breath, rain stinging his face. For years he had lived with silence, kept his house empty, let weeds swallow the porch, let memory rot in the dark. But tonight, in the space of a heartbeat, a fragile life pressed a choice into his hands. He reached out. His large, calloused palm shook not from the cold, but from something deeper. The child shrank back half a step, torn between fear and hope. Lightning showed both in its eyes. "Come on," Elias whispered almost to himself. He lifted the child. Light as dry kindling, it clung to him, silver cross pressed between them, small arms wrapped around his neck. He clenched his jaw and carried it forward through the storm. Midnight fell in at his side, hooves pounding steady, a silent guard. The road from the well to the ranch was barely a mile, but tonight it stretched out like a lifetime. Rain hammered the tin roof of the barn as they passed, the smell of wet earth and cattle thick in the air. Elias kept his cloak wrapped tight, shielding the child against his chest. Its breath was weak, fading, but each time its fingers tightened on the cross, Elias felt his chest ache as though the past itself were crushing him. It was the same image as that night long ago when he held his son limp in his arms, rain falling, thunder rolling, and nothing could bring him back. A peal of thunder split the sky, lightning carved the dark. For an instant it showed their shadows across the plain, three wanderers bound together, a weary man, his horse, and the mystery of a child. At last, Elias reached the porch. The wood creaked under his boots as he turned once, looking back over the endless black prairie. Something in him whispered, this child had not stumbled to his door by chance. Someone had sent it, a truth waiting to be told, a wound demanding to be opened. He pushed the cabin door wide. The faint warmth of the fire clung to the room. Gently, he laid the child on an old blanket near the hearth. For a long moment, he just stared at the silver cross glowing in the red firelight. The storm outside faded into nothing. All Elias could hear was the pounding of his own heart. This strange, rain-soaked night had changed everything. And so I ask you, if it were you finding a lost child in the storm, clutching the very keepsake that tore open your past, what would you do? Part 2. The familiar cross. The storm still hammered against the walls outside, but within the cabin only the red glow of the fire remained. Elias shed his soaked coat and wrapped it gently around the small, trembling body. The child curled up tight on an old wool blanket, lips blue with cold, yet its tiny hand never loosened from the silver cross. Elias sank into a creaking wooden chair, his gaze fixed on that faint gleam of silver in the firelight. Sparks popped from the hearth shadows, flickering along the cracked walls where the wind hissed through every gap. In that heavy silence, he could hear the child's breath, thin, fragile like a thread about to snap. Beyond the walls, the prairie groaned under the storm. A fence post rattled loose in the gale, and farther still, gunfire echoed faintly from some saloon down in town, shots, scattered then swallowed by the night. Elias closed his eyes, exhaling hard. The West was always this way somewhere, loud with violence, yet in here the silence pressed heavier than steel. He looked again at the cross. The silver was worn, its carving still sharp despite the scratches of time. His chest tightened. That was no trinket. That was hers, the keepsake of the woman he had once believed would walk beside him until the end of his days. Memory broke open like a flood. He was young again, 2 decades gone. Summer had scorched the prairie when the sandstorm came roaring down, red dust swallowing the sky. Cattle scattered in panic, bawling wild as the world itself seemed to collapse. He had ridden hard, whip and rifle cracking, fighting to keep the herd from tearing itself apart. Through that chaos she appeared. Her dress clung against her frame hands, shielding her face, but her eyes bright as stars cut straight through the storm. She was the preacher's daughter, newly arrived to help her father raise a chapel on this rough land. And there, in the heart of a sandstorm, fate brought her into his path. Her wagon toppled. She fell. He spurred forward, caught her in his arms. And in that moment, the silver chain snapped, the cross tumbling into his palm. It glimmered in the dust-choked air, a symbol of faith and peace in a land that had none. He handed it back. Their eyes met, and from that moment on, Elias Ward's heart no longer belonged to himself. The fire cracked loud, pulling him back to the cabin. He looked at the child before him, curled close to that same cross, the one he could never mistake. His hand trembled as he reached for it, but the child stirred awake, clutching it tighter, eyes wide with tears and fear, as though someone meant to steal the last thing keeping it alive. Elias drew his hand back, pain slicing through his chest. Outside, the wind howled, long and mournful, like the voice of a past that refused to rest. The fire cracked and hissed, casting trembling patterns across the log walls like the fragments of old memory. Elias knelt beside the blanket, his rough hand hovering close, but never touching, afraid that the smallest contact might scatter everything into smoke. The child lay half asleep, spent from the storm, yet its fingers clamped hard around the silver cross, the chain darkened by rain and road dust. Elias leaned closer into the firelight, tilting his head for a better look. On the left arm of the cross was a small crescent-shaped dent, nothing to a stranger's eye, but to him it was the seal of fate itself. That mark had been cut years ago when a horse's iron shoe clipped it during a wild cattle drive. Dust red as blood, the thunder of hooves, the ball of cattle filling the sky. He had pulled her from danger that day, holding her close as the cross struck against his saddle. She had laughed then, a smile bright enough to light the whole prairie. They had stood together, unmoving, while somewhere nearby a harmonica played a rough, simple tune that felt like prayer. The wind tapped at the window now. From the direction of town came a single gunshot, thin and lonely, like the cry of a wounded hawk. Elias startled from the memory, pulling the blanket higher over the child's shoulders. In the barn, midnight shifted, stamping twice, sharp and wary. Elias rose slowly, pulling off his mud-soaked boots. He ladled warm water from the kettle and wrung out a rag. Carefully, he wiped the grime from the child's brow, tracing a bruise on the wrist that looked like the mark of rope. Something stirred inside him, not thunder this time, but a deep, simmering anger. Out here, men trusted violence more than mercy. He knew the frost of suspicion, the way strangers' eyes could turn a man into an outcast. He set the rag aside and lowered himself to the floor. His Winchester leaned against the wall, stock worn smooth by years of use. In the west, a man kept his rifle close, the way he kept loneliness in sight. His hand brushed the stock, then pulled back. Tonight, there was something greater to guard, a child's fragile breath and a memory reborn. Near midnight, the rain softened to a steady whisper. In that pause, Elias heard hooves, faint at first, then clearer. 2 riders, maybe 3. Their cadence was short, urgent, the kind of riding meant to stay unseen. He raised a hand toward the barn. "Easy," he murmured. Midnight blew once through its nostrils, then fell silent. Elias caught up the storm lantern, turning the wick down until its glow barely touched the floorboards. He glanced at the child, lashes clumped with rain, stirring each time a draft slipped through the door. Still, the cross remained clutched to its chest. A rough laugh carried from the ridge, tangled with curses. Then silence broken by the cold snap of a pistol shot. The northern woods answered with an echo fading. Somewhere a penned herd broke, wild hooves drumming the earth like war drums. Dust and rain whirled across the plain. Elias set the rifle's hammer chambered around and moved barefoot to the porch. The night lay gray as ash, the smell of wet earth mingled with manure and the iron tang of rain on gunmetal. Down the trail, a spark flared, a cigarette glowing once before it died. Someone had stopped listening. Elias stood still, his shadow welded to the post as if he were only another stone in the dark. "We'll split the search by the old well, then cut across the ranch," a voice rasped, just loud enough for the wind to tear in half. "The girl's still out here somewhere." Elias turned his head toward the firelit room. The child shifted in sleep, sobbing softly. A memory struck him hard the night he buried his wife. The townspeople stood at a distance, whispering, their eyes cold with superstition. He had walked away, then built his ranch at the edge of nowhere, trading men's company for weeds and sky. But tonight, silence was no refuge. Tonight, silence was a trap. He slid the bolt across the door, set his boots beneath the rug where they'd not betray him later. The Winchester rested within reach, but he returned to the hearth with slow, deliberate steps. He draped his heavy coat fully over the child to dim the firelight, then added only a splinter of wood. The flame breathed soft but steady. The child's stirred eyes wide, dark as ink, fearful but not afraid of him. Instinct had already told it where safety lay. Its lips moved, no sound at first. Elias poured a little warm water into a tin lid, raised it gently. Small fingers fumbled to take it. "Don't take it," the child whispered, gaze fixed on the cross. "No one's taking it," Elias said, voice low and worn. "Here no one touches it but you." In that moment, he knew his choice was already made. Door open or bolted gun ready or not, the line was drawn. In the West, a man's word was only as strong as the death he was willing to face for it. Elias had spoken his word, and with it, the weight on his shoulders shifted like setting down a stone he'd carried too long. The hoofbeats faded into the dark. Somewhere a harmonica began to play a tune from long ago, soft and uncertain as drifting fog. Elias lifted his head, the sound laying a gentle hand on his neck, guiding him back toward the hearth where hesitation had no place. By dawn, the rain was gone. The fire burned small and golden now, no longer red with fury but gentle with warmth. Elias laid a dry blanket beneath the child, tucked it in like a seedling beneath spring soil. On the table, he set dry bread and a pot of thin soup simmering with onion and beef fat, the smell filling the cabin with something it had not known in years home. The child stirred again. Voice-broken words catching, Mother said, "Keep it safe. Never give it to the bad ones." Elias nodded. "You're doing just right." The child closed its eyes, tears slipping free. In that trembling breath, Elias heard an entire woman's life, the way she once stood at the gate, hand on her cross eyes fixed on the trail that ran west. The night she left town, she turned away before Elias could speak their lives, sealed beneath gossip, suspicion, and the fire that had taken the merchant's store. In the Wild West, justice always came late if it came at all. Elias had learned silence to survive, but silence had cost him everything. Now silence breathed again, only this time with a child's warmth against his chest, a silver cross held between them, its crescent scar glinting, proof of years he had loved and lost. He reached out, touched the chain's edge. The child loosened its grip as if it somehow understood. Elias turned the cross over. Beneath the worn silver lay faint markings, 3 letters entwined. EMW. The middle letter, hers, the 2 on either side his own. They had carved them long ago, young and foolish, promising that if ever we're lost, we'll find our way back. A low laugh rasped from his throat, rough with years, cracked like old timber, not sharp as wind, but bitter with ash. Midnight gave a soft whinny from the stall hooves, tapping a steady rhythm on the boards like a nod of agreement. At the rim of dawn, the first threads of light slid over the ridges, turning gray into silver, silver into gold. Far across the plain, the cattle lowed, not in panic now, but calling one another toward fresh grass. A hawk cut the sky in two, its wings tearing the wind with such clarity, it hushed the heart to listen. Elias placed the cross back into the child's hand, and out of some old instinct he had not dared to feel. In years, he closed his own hand around both. A fragile warmth rose through his wrist, stinging eyes that had long been hardened by dust and rain. "You'll stay here," he said, the words spilling without thought. "Last night, the wind carried back a debt I owed. This morning, I pay it." The child's eyes fluttered open. It managed the faintest smile, tired, yes, but real. Its lips shaped a whisper, soft as a star's name, "Mama." Then sleep returned its grip on the cross, loosening, no longer white-knuckled with fear. Elias leaned back against the wall. The rifle rested at his side, but it no longer weighed on him as it once had. Firelight brushed across his weathered face, softening lines carved by loss into something near to peace. He turned his gaze toward the window where the sky grew pale. In that thin light, the dust of old trails seemed to rise, weaving threads between past and present. He knew the town would whisper when he carried the child in for salt and medicine. He could see the suspicious stares, hear the muttered judgments dressed up as justice. In this country, men had learned to look at one another down a barrel before they looked eye to eye. But in this same country, sometimes a single man's quiet stand was enough to change the color of a story. Elias exhaled long, steady, full. He reached across to pull the door shut against the morning wind. Inside, the fire pulsed steady as a heart finding its beat again. Outside, the trail still led to town, to the saloons, and the worn-out drifters to the gunmen who traded eyes for gold. But today, that same trail also led back home. He looked at the child, and his voice was low, almost spoken to the fire itself. "From here on, you won't be alone." And in that moment, the past stopped demanding its debt. It stepped back, giving way to something new, not loud like gunfire, not wild as a stampede, but quiet as a spoon tapping a pot, and the soft breath of a child keeping time. So I ask you, if it were you, and in a child's hands lay the keepsake of your lost love, would you hold your silence like Elias, or knock on the town's door and demand justice? Share your thoughts below. Part 3. The Buried Name. Night pressed close, broken only by the soft patter of rain on the tin roof and the long moan of wind slipping through the cracks. In the timbered kitchen, the fire snapped and breathed, casting a red-orange glow across the child's face. It lay curled on the old blanket breath, steadying now, lips no longer trembling. Elias sat in the chair opposite, his eyes fixed. He had not let another soul spend the night under his roof since the day he buried his wife and child. Solitude had been his fortress, his shield against the world. But tonight that wall had been breached by a fragile life, clutching a silver cross. The firelight climbed the child's thin cheeks, revealing faint bruises. Elias understood then the girl had traveled far, perhaps running from something or someone. Out here, children did not wander alone unless there was no place left to go. Beyond these walls, the prairie stretched wide, but merciless stray gunshots along forgotten trails, herds gone wild in dust storms, strangers' eyes in saloons ready to shove the weak into the mud. The child stirred eyes half opening. In the glow, her dark pupils gleamed wet, searching. She looked at Elias and whispered, hoarse with weariness, "Do you know my mother?" The words pierced him like an arrow. His throat closed, his hand clenched on his knee until the knuckles burned. He almost turned away, but the child's gaze held him fast, as if it demanded a truth long buried. The fire flared, crackling, sharp, throwing sparks that lit the child's lips as they trembled with the next words. "My mother's name is Marion." Elias froze. The name struck like a hammer to the chest. Marion, the woman he had loved beyond all others, the one he had sworn to protect. She had been the flame that lit his life and the wound that had torn it apart. For years he had forbidden the sound of her name. The town forgot her. He buried her memory in silence. And now, from the mouth of a child, it rose again. Elias slumped back in the chair, eyes widening into the fire. There in the flames he saw her as she once was, Marion, in her plain dress, hair loosed in the prairie wind, fingers brushing the silver cross as she smiled at him. Then the picture shattered, replaced by the choking smoke of that terrible fire, the black sky, the scream that split his heart when all was lost. His chest pounded every beat a clenched fist. The child lifted her gaze, torn between fear and hope. Mama said, "If I got lost, find Elias Ward." His name filled the kitchen, bound to hers, echoing like the verdict of fate itself. Elias's fists tightened, bone stark under the skin. His eyes stung, though he forced the tears back. Only a ragged breath escaped, heavy as a confession. Outside, across the night, a single gunshot cracked sharp final, as if the West itself bore witness that the truth could not be buried any longer. The name Marion lingered in the kitchen air like a wind chime striking against memory. Elias braced his hands on the edge of the table, knuckles white. The firelight threw his shadow long against the wall, rigid and trembling like an old tree bent in the gale. The child's eyes were wide. Mama said, "If I got lost, I should find you. The house with the silver roof, the black horse, the window with the rough blue curtain." Elias turned his head. The curtain still hung there, faded gray, now threadbare in patches from years of wind and sun. She had chosen it that first day they moved in. He remembered a breezy afternoon, her standing on the porch with the fabric in hand, hair catching the sunlight. He remembered the scent of soap she made herself clinging to her arm, and the thin, stubborn laugh that lingered like hay smoke in his chest. Out there. Someone was chasing us, the child whispered, voice breaking. Mama said not to go back to town. They said she brought bad luck. They wanted this. She clutched the cross tight. A breath heavy as rolling stone shook through Elias. This country was strange, wide enough to seem endless, yet cruel enough to back a soul into a corner. Justice came late here. If it came at all, often crawling through a saloon first carried by the smirk of men who measured truth through the barrel of a gun. "What's your name?" Elias asked softly. The child pressed her lips together, weighing whether the question was safe. Then slowly, Grace. The name fell between them, light as ash, yet it changed the fire's color. Grace, a word meaning mercy. Suddenly, Elias remembered a sunlit field long ago, Marion slicing bread gaze drifting far as she murmured, "If we ever have a child, I want to name her Grace, to remind us we were forgiven once." He had laughed then, saying, "In this country you survived better with names that cracked like gunshots." She had only shaken her head. Some names are born to hold the heart. Outside, far away, a single shot cracked thin as a blade skimming flesh. Cattle stirred on the horizon, bawling, then settled. Silence thickened, and Elias heard his heartbeat loud as a hammer striking iron. He leaned close, voice rough. "I knew your mother." Grace blinked a tear, slipping down onto the cross, spreading like rain across tarnished silver. "Mama never spoke bad of anyone. She just said the road was long and we always arrived too late." Elias's mouth trembled. "Every road home is late," he said. Midnight thrust its muzzle through a gap in the stall door, blowing a long sigh. Elias knew what that meant. Whatever waited outside the porch was more than morning mist. But before he stepped into it, he needed to stand straight here by this fire and take back the name he had buried. "Grace," he said, letting the word sit heavy on his tongue. "You're safe here." He tore bread, dipped it in broth, and cooled each spoonful with his breath, waiting as Grace fought to eat. Each faint clink of spoon to bowl rang like footsteps of memory returning. After a few bites, she sagged against the blanket lashes, falling, hand still resting on the chain, as though it were a will she had been charged to keep. Elias poured himself a tin of water, staring at his reflection in the dented cup, a face once reckless now carved deep with tremors of time. He glanced at the Winchester by the wall. The echo of gunfire no longer startled him. It only reminded him how men here were taught to live by the rifle and the reins. Learning softness a man had to teach himself. He dragged a chair close to the hearth and bowed his head like in prayer, not for himself, but for the names tied together on the back of that cross EMW, and for the new one born tonight in the firelight Grace. The dawn wind slipped through the cracks, tilting the flame toward the far wall where a single iron nail jutted out, the nail that once held Marion's bonnet. Elias laid his palm against the rusted metal, breathing in its tang, bitter as blood on autumn air. He saw himself years ago, broken, torn apart, drowning in rumor and suspicion, powerless to save what he loved. Hooves scuffed the trail outside, measured and deliberate. 3 beats pause, 3 more, the gait of men who scout rather than ride. Elias let his hand fall to the leather strap slung over the chair, fingers closing once hard before releasing. In his eyes now flickered something newly sharpened, a thought simple and merciless. Never again will the past choose for me. He turned back slowly, drawing the heavy coat tighter over Grace. "Sleep now. Are you sad that I came?" The sudden question stopped him cold. He bent low, pressing his forehead gently against her damp hair, the smell of rain and road dust rising between them. "I have waited a long time for someone to knock on this door." A small smile flickered across Grace's lips, appeared, then vanished. She drifted to sleep. Elias doused the lantern, leaving the hearth fire the only heartbeat in the room. He stood still for a long while, listening to the valley breathe the groan of timbers, the wind sweeping grass so it brushed against itself like travelers' coats in passing. And he knew when the sun rose, he would ride into town not with bowed head or sidelong glances, but upright to buy salt and medicine to let every eye see this house was no longer empty. He slid the bolt, set the Winchester back in its familiar place, and returned to the fire. Before sitting, he spoke her name softly as if invoking a prayer. Marion. The fire popped, a spark leaping high, glinting against the silver cross in the child's hand as though answering. The first line of dawn scraped across the ridge, thin as a silver thread. The prairie, soaked in last night's rain, shimmered faintly, and the smell of wet earth almost made a man believe in gentleness again. At the threshold, Elias pulled on his hatcoat and boots. He opened the barn. Midnight raised his head, eyes dark as a well, nodding as though he too understood this day would be different. Before cinching the saddle, Elias stepped back to the hearth. Grace was half awake, watching the flames with clear, steady eyes. "Where are you going into town? And I'll come back." He paused a beat. "Do you want anything?" Grace shook her head, then suddenly dug into her torn pocket. She pulled out a crumpled scrap of paper, rain-stained, ink-smeared. The top line still read "Ward." Beneath it, a short prayer written in a hand Elias knew as well as his own Marion's. The last words bled into smoky streaks, but 3 remained. "Don't leave. Grace." He spoke the name full, round, reverent. Grace. For a long moment he was silent, then folded the paper and pressed it back into her hand. "You keep it. It's yours." From afar, rifle cracks echoed at a cowboy's practice range. A herd gathered for market, stirred hooves, thundering red dust into low clouds. A lone traveler led a mule down the trail, glancing toward the porch, with the wary look of these parts, quick to see the bad, slow to speak of the good. Elias stood straight, unflinching, letting the man see the child inside, the silver cross flashing, and the eyes of a rancher no longer hiding in his own shadow. He returned to the hearth, laying his warm palm on Grace's brow, a gesture he had once forgotten how to make. "I'll be back before the sun leans west." "What will you say to them?" Grace asked. Elias drew the reins through his hands, lips curling into a thin smile. "I'll say the truth. Out here sometimes the truth is the only wall that stands against the wind." He led Midnight into the yard. The wind scraped the grass, lifting red dust in a fine veil that clung to his boots. Each hoofbeat struck steady as a vow. Elias looked down the trail, a seam of earth stitching past to present. He knew the town would shake their heads, whisper, sneer bad luck. Maybe some guns would be oiled, polished. But he was no longer the hollowed trunk of his former self. Before mounting, he turned. The door stood ajar, Grace upright within, silver cross in her hands, her hair crowned by a thin ring of morning light. Elias touched the brim of his hat, gave a single nod, then spurred. Midnight leapt forward, golden dust rising, carrying with it the faint song of a harmonica from some hidden hollow, the tune of those who refused to turn back. The cabin receded behind him, but the fire still burned ahead because for the first time in many years, Elias knew where he was coming home to. On the road, he passed the old abandoned well, the place where only last night the storm had set a child into his life like a seal pressed onto wet parchment. He slowed, touched 2 fingers to his hat brim, and saluted fate itself, uninvited yet inescapable. Then he turned toward town, where suspicion waited, where gunfire and men's voices would measure what a rancher's word was worth. But behind him in the cabin, a name once buried was spoken again without breaking. Marion, and beside it, a new name settled into the walls, learning how to stay. Grace. So I ask you, if a name long buried rose again through the hands of a child, would you stay silent under its weight, or stand before the whole town and say, "Enough"? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Part 4. The Hearthfire. The fire cracked in the stove, its light dancing across the rough-hewn walls. Elias turned the iron pot hanging from the hook, steam curling upward, weaving through the kitchen like a small mist. He dropped in a strip of dried meat, a handful of wild onion, and the last of the potatoes left over from the season before. The water murmured and boiled, a thin fragrance spreading, covering the smell of rain-soaked clothes and damp timber. The child sat curled close to the hearth, eyes fixed on his every movement. When the spoon scraped the pot, its ring was sharp in the silence, a sound that reminded Elias of clinking spoons against bowls long ago, a sound he had lived without too long. Grace bit her lip, torn between hunger and fear. Elias saw it all but spoke no word. Outside, the prairie still carried its noise. A gunshot snapped somewhere in the night, followed by the hollow howl of dogs from a distant camp. In the Wild West, peace was thin as old cloth. One gust could tear it to shreds. Elias had grown used to such sounds as a man grows used to breathing. But tonight at the fire, he wanted them muffled by the scent of soup rising steady in the air. When it was ready, Elias ladled out a bowl, set it gently on the table, and pushed it toward the child. Eat. Small hands trembled as they lifted the bowl, cradling it with both palms. Steam rolled against her face, blinking her eyes. Then she sipped one small mouthful at a time. Outside, rain dripped steady on the porch, but in the kitchen, the faint sound of a spoon against a bowl was clear as a prayer. Elias sat across from her, silent, watching as though each breath of the child was warming him too. Grace ate slowly, but with each sip the cold retreated. Color returned to her cheeks in the firelight. Her hand never left the silver cross yet. Her grip eased. Elias noticed something strange, something startling. In the child's eyes, so fragile yet so strong, there glowed the same light he once saw in Marion. He stood and laid another log on the fire. Sparks flew, striking the brick floor sharp as plucked strings. Each time the flame rose, the kitchen glowed brighter, pushing the darkness farther back from the windows. Elias pulled his chair closer, resting his elbows on the table, watching the child finish her bowl. A sudden gust slammed the roof, rattling the frame. Grace startled spoon clattering into the bowl broth, spilling across the table. She clutched the cross-tight eyes wide with fear. Elias lowered his hand to the table, voice deep and steady. "It's nothing. This is home. The wind can't take anything from you here." The words slipped out, surprising even him. How long had it been since he used the word home? Once this kitchen had rung with laughter, once these hands had set plates for more than one. Since that day of loss, the place had been nothing but hollow timber. But tonight, with a lost child sitting across from him, it had become shelter again. Grace pressed her lips together, nodded faintly, and picked the spoon back up. Firelight trembled across her eyes, glowing like two small, stubborn stars. Elias realized then that in this lonely cabin, hope had returned, timid, gentle, but certain as real as the scent of soup filling the room. The bowl of soup sat nearly empty. Grace laid her head on her arm, eyelids heavy with sleep. Elias cleared the dish, set it aside, then sat back down at the table. The fire's glow reflected in his eyes, tracing every line age and sorrow had carved into his face. Then hoofbeats sounded faint in the distance. Slow. Careful. Elias frowned, raising his gaze toward the door. In the Wild West, no storm night was ever empty. There were always riders, wanderers, or gunmen passing through, most of them bringing stories few men wanted to hear. He knew the feeling well out here. Every sound in the dark might carry trouble with it. From the barn, midnight stamped the floor uneasy. Elias rose in silence, lowered the wick of the lantern until only the fire remained, then eased himself back into the chair, his hand resting on the worn stock of the Winchester beside him. The dark beyond the window felt like a pair of watching eyes. Grace breathed steady, but her small hand still gripped the silver cross. Elias stared at that fragile hand, and a thought came sharp. Maybe fate was testing him again, forcing him to choose, to stand or to turn away as he once had. The wind rattled the panes. Grace startled, awake eyes wide with fear. Elias leaned down at once, his voice low and steady like an old song remembered. "It's all right. You're still here. And so am I." For the first time, he laid his rough, calloused hand across hers. A man's hand scarred by reins and rifles, covering the small, trembling hand of a child. Grace lifted her gaze, eyes shimmering in the firelight. One heartbeat, two. Then she sighed, letting her hand rest in his. The fire shone across their faces, one old and worn, one young and fragile, and between them a cord invisible but newly tied. Elias felt something loosen in his chest, the pain of years shrinking into a silence that wasn't empty anymore. From far off, a harmonica carried on the night air a tune Marion had once loved. The fire crackled with joy, throwing a warmth that turned the kitchen from a tomb of memory into a place where life began again. The night wore thin. Outside, the rain slowed, the wind gentled. Inside, only the fire's soft breath remained and the rhythm of two lives sharing its glow. Grace drifted into deeper sleep, face calm at last. Elias pulled a blanket up over her shoulders. He sat there long into the hours watching, and in the old man's heart, a small green shoot of hope broke through, no longer the vague hope of youth, but one born of loss of wounds, endured. He understood now this child had brought him more than memory. She had brought a chance to live again, not for himself alone, but for the name he lost, and for the girl now asleep by the hearthfire. The flame burned low, but it did not die. It glowed like a vow whispered into the dark morning would come, and with it a new chapter. Elias drew in a long breath and told himself, "Tomorrow, I will not be silent." If a small fire could rekindle hope in a lonely man's heart, do you believe the presence of a child can heal an entire life? Share your thoughts below. Part 5. Ghosts of the Past. Outside, the prairie lay hushed after the storm. Only the wind moved, sighing through the sparse pines, slipping into the cracks and seams of the cabin, making the timber frame tremble as though it were breathing. In the barn, midnight snorted, stamped twice, then fell quiet again. Elias sat alone before the fire. The child slept soundly now, her breathing a steady whisper in the small kitchen. He rested his elbows on his knees, staring into the embers, letting the sparks crack and burst like memories he had long tried to bury. But this silence was not the same as all the other nights. It was no longer the hollow quiet of a man resigned to solitude. It was a weighted stillness, like someone had taken a seat beside him, turning the pages of the past he had locked away. Gunfire echoed faint from the town, dry and ragged. Then came the long, lonely howl of wolves up in the northern ridge. The sounds tangled with the wind into a grim chorus, dragging him back to the most brutal day of his life. Elias closed his eyes, and at once he was there again. It had been an afternoon thick with heat, the air swollen like the sky and earth were fixing for a fight. The whole town was buried in a storm of red dust. Sand devils twisted across the prairie like whips of fire. His cattle had broken wild, bawling in terror, thundering through the haze like an army gone mad. Hooves struck the hardpan in furious rhythm, throwing crimson clouds high into the air. Elias and the other cowboys had shouted themselves raw, cracking whips, firing rifles to drive the herd back, but the storm was too fierce. Dust and noise swallowed everything. Gunshots snapped through the gale, drowned by the roar of hooves, the bellows of frightened steers, chaos loud as war. And through it, he saw her, Marion clutching their infant to her chest, running from the porch toward the barn, her figure small against the storm dress, whipping in the wind. Elias shouted her name, but his voice was lost in the dust. He saw her stumble, shielding the child, just as a dead cottonwood roots torn loose by the gale crashed down. He spurred his horse, riding like a madman, but too late. When he reached her, blood stained her temple, soaking into her hair. The baby in her arms was gasping a thin cry, cutting into Elias like a blade. He screamed for help, but the others were still driving cattle blind to everything else. The storm drowned his pleas. The gunfire, the bawling herd, the howl of the wind, all of it smothered the sound of his child's last breath. That night, Elias laid them both into the earth beneath the cottonwood behind the house. The moon drifted pale across the ridge, silver light spilling over fresh graves, while the wind keened like someone mourning. The townsfolk came to look, but none offered comfort. They only whispered, "That land is cursed. It's bad luck." Then they turned their backs, leaving him alone with 2 mounds of earth and a silence that never ended. From that night on, Elias chose silence. He built walls of stone around his heart, sealing himself in, and of all the doors he closed, he left just one open for midnight, the black horse who never once left his side. The night stretched long, a black ribbon wrapped tight around the prairie. In the kitchen, the fire had burned low. murmuring faint as the breath of a weary man. Elias rose, pulled his coat around his shoulders, and stepped out the back door. The yard still smelled of wet earth, rich and raw. Above, the clouds had torn just enough to show a thin blade of moon, sharp cold like steel, left naked in the dark. He walked toward the cottonwood. 2 graves rested there in the damp shadows, weeds grown around their edges, rain beads on the leaves glinting silver in the moonlight. Elias knelt, pressing his calloused palm flat against the chilled ground, as if he might still feel the faint pulse of memory beneath it. On the trunk, the old carving remained M+E, cut by a young man's trembling knife. Beneath it, a shallow slash like a strand of wind caught and held in the wood. He remembered how after they carved it, she had laughed, pressed her cross to the mark, and whispered, "Let the Lord stand witness to this promise," and how life had torn that vow apart with dust storms, with gunfire, with the cold eyes of a town that spoke harder than bullets. Elias closed his eyes. At once he heard it again, the thin, sharp cry of the child that night, cutting through him the ragged sound of his own voice, shouting into the storm, and the hiss of whispers that followed bad luck. That land's cursed. A man who loses wife and child can't hold on to anything. The blade of moon slid behind clouds, then struck free again, sharper. "You came too late." Marion's voice rose not from earth or wind, but from the deepest hollow inside him. "I know," Elias whispered, his forehead resting against the bark. His words drifted into mist. "I know." A gust lashed the prairie. From the edge of town came a lone rifle crack, one restless cowboy, or a guard teasing the dark. Somewhere a herd shifted hooves, pounding the soaked earth, dull as war drums retreating. Elias stood. He kept his hand against the tree a moment longer, as if holding her hand once more. Then he turned back toward the cabin, carrying with him the scent of wet bark and an old decision made new again. When he reached the porch, midnight lifted its head, ears rigid, snorting once clear warning company. The wind carried it in horse sweat, cheap tobacco, and the metallic bite of wet gun barrels. Elias set a hand on the latch, but did not go inside. He leaned into the dark eyes, narrowing. 3 figures sat mounted at the edge of the trail grass, beaten black beneath their hooves. A spark of tobacco flare died. Leather creaked. The old Ward Ranch one rasped tongue clicking. "He thinks he can hide forever. The girl didn't get far. She was clutching something that shined. We take her back, and the debt's settled." Another voice said, younger, uncertain. Elias turned back inside, lifted the Winchester, lowered the lantern until its glow thinned to fog. The fire hummed steady. Grace curled tight in her blanket, her hand pressed against her heart where the cross lay cold on her skin. Elias moved to the front door, cracked it open, and let the night wind blow along the rifle's barrel cold all the way to his elbow. He did not call out. In this country, silence was a language men understood. He set the stock firm, sighted the earth 3 paces before their horses, and squeezed. The shot cracked sharp and clean. Mud burst skyward, red dust hissing like smoke. The horses reared, whinnied loud into the night. One rider cursed his gun half clear of its holster. Elias worked the lever chambered again, fired. The second shot splintered a broken fence post a hand's width from a man's cheek. Shards of wood lashed across his skin. This time Elias spoke low, steady, his voice carrying across the yard like wind through canyon stone. "The trail runs onto town. There's whiskey there and cards and plenty of guns. But here there's fire and a child. Choose." Silence held tight as a noose. Then reins jerked, metal rang, leather snapped. The youngest spat into the mud, turned his horse. The rasp-voiced one growled but followed. Their shadows bled into the ridge and were gone. The air loosened. Farther out, where night still held a harmonica, stumbled into a tune someone in a camp trying their breath. Elias lowered the rifle, worked the latch closed, leaned his shoulder to the post. His heart beat, steady, not hurried, like an old wagon wheel freshly oiled. From the barn, midnight struck 3 times, the last hoof-fall long, and sure the nod of a faithful partner. Elias's hand brushed the Winchester's stock. It felt lighter now, A piece of the past had splintered off, scattered like the shards of that fence post. The Winchester was back in its place, the bolt drawn, the door shut tight. Elias returned to the kitchen where the fire burned low, small and steady like a tired child, drifting toward sleep. Grace stirred, half opening her eyes, looking at him through lashes and firelight. The gaze was dim, but calm. "It's all right," he said, lowering himself to the edge of the rug. "The wind has shifted." The child asked nothing more, no who or why. She simply inched closer to the hearth, drawing a deep breath. One small hand reached toward the flame, felt its warmth, then settled against the silver cross, not clutching now, but touching, as though laying a palm against her mother through a thin layer of heat. Elias looked at that hand, and in the moonlight cutting across the window, he let himself bow his head. The tears came quietly sliding down his cheeks, leaving clean, salty lines. The last time he wept, the graves beneath the cottonwood were still raw. Since then, he had held himself together, the way a man holds the reins of a wild horse. The tighter the grip, the harder it pulls, the faster it runs into nowhere. Grace blinked. Startled children in this country rarely saw men cry. Elias shook his head, a strange, thin smile touching his lips. "Just water in the house," he said. "Let it run." Outside, the night was retreating. Cattle shifted on the ridge, their balls rolling like a greeting to morning. Deep in town, a saloon door banged once wind, carrying the smell of old whiskey and half-told stories down the boardwalk. The stares and whispers would return when Elias led his horse through those streets, but this morning he knew he would not walk alone, even if it was only a child's hand tugging lightly at his coat. "Tomorrow," he said, "I'll take you to the druggist. We'll buy bandages, salt, and a good wool scarf for the cold winds coming." He paused, then added, "And if you'd like a small book, the kind with horses drawn in it." Grace nodded, a smile flickering fragile as a new flame. "Are you afraid of them?" she asked. Elias thought a long moment, as if feeling out where fear still lived inside him. "Of course," he said at last, "but this time, fear rides behind me." He pulled the blanket up over her shoulders. The fire whispered low, the scent of broth lingering faint in the bowl, warm as a promise half kept. On the wall, the nail that once held Marion's bonnet threw a long shadow, shorter now as the night withdrew. Elias leaned back against the wall, eyes lifting to the blackened beam above. His voice was no louder than the crackle of the embers. "Marion, I'll carry her into the light. I'll speak your name, without bowing my head." The crescent moon slid across the window, laying a pale band of silver over the cross in Grace's hand. The letters EMW shimmered faint but clear. Elias tamped the fire low, leaving it to smolder enough to hold warmth, not enough to invite trouble. Then he closed his eyes, and in his chest something shifted, fitted back into place, turning again. A new day would come with red dust rising under hooves, with stray shots cracking outside the saloon, with eyes narrowed in judgment. And perhaps one slow nod. But before any of it, he had already touched what mattered most, the courage to face the ghosts and return to the fire. The flame breathed steady. The child slept. The man of silence opened his eyes, looked across the room, and whispered no louder than wind scraping the porch. "Here it begins. If you carried a ghost of your past, would you keep running or turn to face it the way Elias just did? Share your thoughts below." Part 6. A message from the departed. In the wooden kitchen, the fire had burned low, only scattered embers glowing faint as lost stars. Outside, the wind worried the broken fence, its groan carrying near and far like the lament of land that never slept. On the high plains, the night was never gentle. From time to time, stray gunshots echoed back from the saloon, then died, leaving only a chill that crawled the spine. Elias leaned against the wall, eyes heavy with sleeplessness. But each time he closed them, memory struck like a blade, forcing him open again to the sight of the fire, holding on so he wouldn't drown. In the corner, Grace lay upon a crude wooden bed, the one he had once built for a son who never lived to fill it. The straw mattress rustled softly each time she shifted. Her small face was turned sideways, cheeks faintly flushed from the hearth's warmth. In her hand, the silver chain slipped loose, catching what little moonlight trickled through the cracks. Elias could not look away. That cross was a bridge between two worlds. On one side, the woman he had loved. On the other, the child now asleep under his roof. Suddenly, Grace stirred lips, moving voice thin as mist, but sharp enough to pierce the silence. Mama said, "If I get lost, find you." Elias sat bolt upright, heart hammering like hooves beneath the ground. He bent, close hand trembling as it touched the edge of the bed. The child's eyes stayed shut, yet she whispered again, You won't leave me." Mama believed it. The words fell into the room, thickening the air. Elias's throat clenched, the prairie wind itself seeming to tighten around him. He rose, stepping out to the porch. The wind rushed across the grass, carrying the smell of wet earth mingled with the distant bawl of cattle. Somewhere in the valley, a herd broke and stampeded, hooves drumming the soaked ground like funeral drums. Elias gripped the doorframe, let the wind lash his face, trying to draw breath in the storm within. Mama said, "If I get lost, find you." The words struck again, hammer against anvil. He remembered Marion's eyes that night. They parted clear but heavy with sorrow, as if she already knew justice would never stand with them. She had left town in darkness, clutching her cross, whispering only one thing: "If there is any miracle, I'll let this be the way back." And now that miracle lay inside his house in the hands of a child who called Marion mother. Elias asked himself, was this redemption or a new sentence passed down? A single shot cracked from far off, dry and sharp, pulling him back. In the west, a man fired not only to kill, but to remind the world he still lived and that others should beware. Elias knew well tomorrow when he led Grace into town, the stairs would tighten, the whispers return. Folks would ask, where'd she come from? Why is she under Ward's roof? He drew a long breath, then stepped back inside. Grace still slept, her hand curled around the cross. Marion's message, though spoken years ago, had crossed storms, gossip, even death itself to reach this place. Elias shivered, yet felt something else stir. Sometimes ghosts did not come to haunt. Sometimes they came to guide. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned, low embers scattered like stray stars. Outside, the wind worried the loose fence boards, their groan drifting back and forth like the land itself, muttering in its sleep. On the high plains, night was never gentle now, and then a shot cracked from the saloon, sharp and dry, and left the air colder than before. Elias drew a chair close to the rough wooden bed. The frame rasped against his trousers, the smell of pine resin and kitchen ash mingling in the air. He sat still as a moved tree stump, listening to the thin breath of the child. Across the window pane, a blade of moonlight cut through, laying a pale line across the blanket, dividing shadow in two. Grace stirred, her lips parted, voice smaller than dust. "Last night, the wind was strong. Mama said, if I get lost, don't be afraid. Follow the sound of the harmonica, then ask for the house with the silver roof, the black horse, named Midnight." Elias flinched. In all the valley, only his ranch bore a silver roof torn by wind. Only his barn held a black horse faithful all these years. Fear and gratitude struck him at once. He leaned closer, and the whisper faltered on. Mama said, "If they ask for the cross, don't give it. Walk until you see the broken fence on the eastern ridge, and the cottonwood with the carving. When you see it, call for Elias Ward." His throat closed. The carving on that cottonwood M+E burned now like a brand across his own skin. From far off came the rush of a driven herd, hooves pounding, red dust rising like a bloody mist across the ground. A single rifle shot cracked flat and was swallowed by the wind. The prairie itself was reminding him every promise had to be paid, standing tall. Grace's hand clutched the cross tight again, her breathing falling soft and even. Elias touched the edge of her pillow with one finger, as though careful not to disturb a sleeping butterfly. He whispered, not knowing if he spoke to the child, the fire, or the woman beyond memory, "I hear you." As if in answer, Midnight coughed once in the barn, then fell silent. The moon slipped past the rafters, leaving the room darker, warmer, the darkness of a home. Elias pulled a weathered chest from beneath the bed, lifted the lid. The smell of pitch and old canvas rose. Among nails, tack straps, and scraps of saddle leather lay a harmonica tarnished with years. He held it a moment, then set it on the table. He hadn't played it since the burial. Carefully, he slid the chain from Grace's neck just enough to dry it with a clean cloth. She stirred in her sleep but no longer snatched it back. When he turned the cross, the faint engraving caught the moon EMW, a narrow road of light across the dark. Elias traced the letters with his thumb, memory rising sharp, then easing. Outside, the wind scraped the grass, tossing thin red dust into ribbons across the trail. From town came the clatter of a saloon piano, brittle notes cut short, followed by coarse laughter and a shot flung skyward. The whole prairie seemed to blink at the noise. Elias slid the chain back, fastening it to her dress with a coarse stitch of hemp thread, the way plainsfolk secured what must never be lost. Then he leaned in the doorway, scanning the ridge. No riders, now only clouds dragging shadows torn by wind. His mind settled. At dawn, he would take Grace to see Widow Mary on the edge of town, the keeper of the small library, the one who remembered what others tried to bury. Mary had been there the day the dust storm stole everything. She knew the sting of rumor's bite. If anyone dared to speak truth where law was thin as sun-dried hide, it was her. Elias sat back down. His throat caught when he saw Grace's hand loosening from the cross for the first time, letting it rest against her skin, like sunlight, not a shackle. He laid his own hand over the blanket, not pressing. The fire shifted, hue red, fading into a gold like honey. "Tomorrow we ride to town," he said, each word hammered like nails into plank. "And I'll call your name, in front of them all." The wind sighed over the tin roof, long then gone. In the west, sometimes a slow word carried farther than a volley of bullets. Before dawn, the world held that thin pause, like fingers parted before clasping again. Elias built the fire higher, hung the kettle, and let steam curl white into the mist. He poured himself weak coffee, gave Grace warm water sweetened with black sugar. The girl woke. Sleep still shimmered in her eyes, but they were clear. She took the cup, drank, and looked around as if testing the edges of a dream. Elias smiled, the kind of smile he thought he'd forgotten. "Last night you spoke of a harmonica," he said softly. "There was a song once." He raised the old instrument to his lips. The first notes cracked his breath stiff, but soon a slow tune rose, the one Marion loved most. Plain, gentle like wind through grass, like moonlight across water. The music wandered the kitchen, brushed the cracked wall, the rusty nail, the empty bowl, and came to rest in Grace's eyes. She lifted her head, nodded faintly. Yes, it was this house. Outside, the herd returned from their night range, bawling by the creek as dawn broke. From the training yard, morning gunfire snapped dry but not cruel. A lone traveler led a mule past the trail, glancing toward the porch. His eyes wary as all men's here softened when he saw the scene. A man playing harmonica by the fire and a child holding a cross, smiling. He paused, touched his hat in an old-fashioned greeting, then walked on. Elias lowered the harmonica, hung it by the stove. He pulled an old wool scarf, Marion's unfinished knitting, and wrapped it around Grace's neck. The yarn was faded but warm. "The east wind's sharp today," he said. "We'll ride early. We'll ride back early." Grace touched the scarf, then the edge of his coat. "Mama said, you'd know who I was when you heard that song." She faltered. "She said, you were the only one who never turned away." Elias bowed his head. The words passed through him like a silent flock crossing mountains. He felt his shoulders rise half an inch taller. Then, "Hear me," he said. "I'll be the last man to leave." He saddled Midnight, led the horse from the barn. The first light spilled across the ridge, laying gold across the torn tin roof, the broken fence line, the cottonwood carved with M+E. Once mere ruins of a past life, they now shone like a map pointing forward. Elias lifted Grace into the saddle before him, just as he had once carried his son. She leaned against him by instinct, the cross tapping cold against his shirt, then warming. He swung the gate wide, spurred. Midnight surged hooves striking wet earth, flinging mud like ink dots on a sentence just ended. The trail stretched open, red dust fresh under the new sun. At its far end lay the town with its judging eyes, its saloon music sharp and raw, its gunmen polishing steel. But here at its beginning rode a message that had crossed storm rumor and even death to reach him. Elias did not look back. He only spoke quiet enough for the wind to carry Marion. I've heard. From a nearby camp, a harmonica drifted, someone testing the old tune. The notes mingled with sun-warmed dust, wet grass and oiled leather forming a greeting to the day. Their shadows fell long across the trail, one man, one child, one black horse, 3 fresh strokes upon a new page. If a message crossed storms, prejudice, and even death itself to find you, would you follow it as Elias did, or turn away and let the night swallow it? Share your choice below. Part 7. The Town's Whispers. Red dust rose thick behind the horses' hooves. The trail into town stretched out like a scar across the prairie. Elias rode tall in the saddle reins, steady in his hands. In front of him, Grace sat small beneath a faded wool scarf, the silver cross pressed tight to her chest. Each step Midnight lifted sent dust up his trousers, mixing with the smells of leather sweat and the cold iron of the rifle at his hip. The town emerged ahead, a row of weathered wooden buildings, shutters, cracked signs swinging loose in the wind. The saloon was, as always, the loudest place, broken piano notes tumbling into rough laughter. Beyond it, the small church stood with its rusting bell tower, and beside that, the blacksmith's forge belching gray smoke, each hammer strike against the anvil, beating like the weary heart of a town that never truly slept. As Elias led Midnight down the main street, every eye turned his way. Men rocking whiskey glasses on the steps froze mid-swig. Women lifted aprons to cover their mouths, whispering quick into each other's ears. A child ran out pointing, "There's old Ward, he's got a kid with him." His mother yanked him back inside. Gunfire rattled from the practice yard on the edge of town, short, dry bursts. Elias didn't look back. He was used to noise, but today every glance, every whisper cut like stray bullets striking between his shoulders. Grace curled against his chest, her tiny frame trembling. "Hold tight," Elias murmured, his hand closing over hers. The words steadied them both. The saloon doors flung wide, wind carrying out the reek of whiskey and tobacco. 3 cowboys stepped into the street, pistols slung loose at their hips, eyes narrowing beneath wide brims. They studied Elias, then the girl. One spat a crooked grin. "Ward," he sneered, "you taking in another mouth to feed, or just picking up strays to keep you company?" The street fell silent. Then the whispers broke loose like a hive torn open. "Some bastard child. Who knows where she came from? Now she clings to Ward. That ranch was cursed already. Now worse." Each word scraped across Elias's skin, sharper than steel. He didn't answer. He held the reins firm, guiding Midnight slow but steady. His eyes stayed forward, not avoiding, not seeking, only the look of a man long familiar with the backs of townsfolk. Grace buried her face deeper, but her hand never let go of the cross. She held it like a shield, and Elias could feel the tremor in her palm, pain heavier than any insult. Out here, bullets could kill a man's body, but it was the stares, the whispers that killed his soul. Elias knew he would not let this child suffer the same wound he and Marion had borne before. He drew a breath, and when he spoke, his voice was gravel, low, cracked, but clear enough to carry the length of the street. "This child rides with me. If anyone's got something to say it to my face." From the forge, the hammer struck again, sharp and ringing like a drum, forcing men to meet the truth head on. But no one stepped forward. Only the murmurs lingered softer now, curling thin in the wind. Elias knew then the true trial had only just begun. Midnight stamped the dry ground, red dust puffing up in small clouds, folding into the suffocating air of town. Elias sat tall in the saddle, saying nothing. Grace clung close against him, wide eyes darting at the crowd, gathering along both sides of the street. On the porch of the general store, the old shopkeeper folded her arms, scowling. Outside the saloon, a young gunman spun his Colt lazily in one hand, flashing steel like a threat. eyes crossed from porch to porch, weaving a net of judgment, contempt, and suspicion no rope needed when stairs themselves could choke a man. A gust of wind cut through the street, rattling a sign on rusty hinges. The piano inside the saloon choked to silence, leaving a hush so sharp it hurt the ears. From the practice yard beyond town came the crack of rifles, dry, careless shots, a reminder that on this frontier the weak had no place. Elias lifted his head, letting his gaze sweep over them all. His eyes, sunken and worn, glowed like embers fanned by wind. That silence of his pressed harder than any shout, and the street sagged under it for a beat. Then a man stepped forward, middle-aged face flushed with whiskey cigarette hanging limp from his lips. He spat on the ground and barked Ward. "Whose brat is that, or is she?" "Marion's." The name split the air like a whip crack. The street erupted, whispers swelling into waves. Some laughed bitter, others froze still, but every face was taut with curiosity, waiting for the blow to land. Elias clenched his jaw, his palm steadying on his thigh to hold back the storm boiling in his chest. Dust storms screams the memory of that child's cry years ago surged like floodwater. Grace tilted her face up at him, lips trembling, confused. His voice came out raw, gravel thick, but each word was hammered clear. "Her name is Grace. From this day on, she lives at my ranch. Any man who dares speak against her will answer to me first." The wind whipped dust across the street, blurring the eyes that bore into them. A silence deep as a grave settled. The drunkard's throat worked. Then he turned, cursing under his breath, and pushed away. The crowd did not scatter, but the murmurs shrank thin as gnats buzzing. On the streets of the West, sometimes one sentence weighed heavier than a dozen guns. Elias dismounted, lifted Grace into his arms, and walked toward the apothecary. Eyes still clung to his back, whispers crawling like smoke. "Cursed ranch. He'll bring ruin on us all. Some bastard child." Grace pressed her face into his chest. The cross clenched tight. Elias felt her heartbeat against him, shaken but steady. He stopped in the middle of the street, turned to face them full. "You turned your backs on me. On Marion. On the truth itself," he said slowly, each word like a bullet driving into the dirt. "But today, I won't let this child bear what we bore. She is a human soul. She is here. Proof that some things cannot be buried." Overhead, the midday moon slipped behind clouds, leaving a gray spear of light hanging sharp as a blade over the street. The town froze, hushed, but restless dust swirling in the wind. Elias carried Grace onward, his stride steady, leaving behind faces caught between shame and disbelief. If an entire town turned its back, would you stand tall like Elias, take the weight and speak the truth? Or would you stay silent and let the past bury it all? Part 8. The Trial. Morning in town hung heavy as lead. Gray clouds dragged low across the sky, and the wind off the prairie carried the stench of manure, the heat of the blacksmith's forge, and the sour bite of whiskey spilling out of the saloon. From the training yard came the snap of rifle fire, dry sharp, each report a reminder that in this land justice was always measured at the muzzle of a gun. Elias led Grace into the center of Main Street. The crowd gathered on both sides, their eyes locked, waiting. Yesterday's whispers had hardened into something else, expectation. Folks wanted to see whether he would stand or break. A heavy-set man with a belly over his belt stepped forward, the banker, who also sat the town council. His voice cracked out loud, hard as hammer on iron. "Ward, you bring this child into town, stirring up the whole street. Speak plain, who is she? If you got no proof, don't bring more curse upon us." The murmurs rose like flies. Faces narrowed with scorn, others craned with curiosity. Grace shrank behind Elias, small hand clutching his coat. Slowly, Elias turned, placing himself square in front of her. His eyes, red from sleepless nights, deep as worn wells, met the crowd. Silence fell, broken only by the creak of a signboard and the restless sweep of dust across the street. "This child," he said, his voice raw but steady, "her name is Grace. She is flesh of my flesh, by blood or by choice I claim her. Any man here who would deny it, step forward and try." The words dropped like a stone into a dry well, echoing where nothing lived. From the saloon came a mocking laugh. A young cowboy swaggered out, palm slapping the butt of his colt. Flesh and blood, old man, you just making claims to hide behind. That girl's a curse. Don't you remember your wife and son died in that sandstorm, and now you'll drag the whole town down with you. The crowd roared into whispers, a storm of voices, dust spinning with it. Elias heard every syllable like shards of glass against his skin. He remembered the days after Marion's death, those same eyes upon him, cold as judgment, branding him a man forsaken. He stepped forward, shielding Grace fully. His hand stayed off the rifle, yet the way he stood made men hesitate. Nearby, midnight nickered, low stamping once, twice, ready, unwilling to retreat. You speak of curses. Elias's voice cut low sharp. His eyes raked across the crowd. Curses don't come from a child holding a cross. They come from your own tongues when you turn away from the ones who need you most. The air held its breath. From the back of the crowd, a cane struck the ground. Widow Mary, keeper of the town's small library, shuffled forward. Bent with years, her eyes were dim, but her voice was clear as bell metal. I know this child. Her mother was Marion. Long ago, you would not believe her. At least now, believe in the child. Her cane struck again, sharp final. The murmurs faltered. Dust swirled between the buildings, a fence groaned on the edge of town, and from the range came the steady crack of rifle fire like a heartbeat pressing against the silence. Elias stood over Grace, broad shoulders casting her in shadow, his figure cutting the street in two. If the crowd turned on you, would you have the strength to shield the innocent and speak truth like Elias? Or would you keep silent and let the curse of whispers live on? The crack of Widow Mary's cane had barely faded when a broad-shouldered man stepped from the edge of the crowd. His hat brim cast a shadow over narrow eyes, and at his hip hung a worn colt that had spoken first in more than one cattle feud. Folks knew his name, Crowley, known for drawing fast and for never waiting long enough to think. Crowley's gaze slid from Elias to the child, and his grin bent crooked sharp with scorn. Ward, you're old. You might stand against me, but you can't stand against the whole town. A child with no father, no mother, only brings trouble. You take her in, she'll drag more ruin to your door. The street went still. Every eye waited for Elias to falter. A sign groaned on rusty hinges, and from beyond the town gunfire snapped flat and hollow, beating time like a war drum. Elias didn't draw. He walked forward each step, solid boots raising coils of red dust. When he stopped just a few strides away, his voice rang low and hard as forged steel. This child is my blood. Any man who aims to touch her will do it over my dead body. Crowley froze. The air split with tension. His hand rested on the butt of his pistol, but Elias's eyes, cold, still, and bottomless, were a barrel already leveled, a shot already chambered. Wind tore through the street, lifting straw and grit, blinding the edges of vision. But through the haze, Elias stood unmoved, an old tree the storm could not break. He turned, his words falling like iron on stone. Years ago, you let Marion walk into exile. You watched me lose everything and turned your backs. Today, I ask for no pity. I demand this, you will hear me. This child has a name, has blood, and has a home. That home is my ranch. The saloon sign banged against its chains, the hollow thud like a drumbeat echoing the weight of his vow. A few townsfolk dropped their eyes. Widow Mary lifted her chin cane, tapping once, whispering a prayer only she and God could hear. Crowley growled, but his hand slid from the pistol grip. He spat into the dust, then spun on his heel shoulders tight with anger and walked off. The silence that followed was heavier than any gunfight. Elias turned back to Grace. She looked up, eyes still wet but bright with a fierce light of their own. He set his rough hand on her shoulder, voice catching yet firm, "You are not alone. I've said it before them all." The street held its breath. A man once branded cursed had stood tall without firing a shot, and in the West, that meant more than bullets. The church bell tolled, suddenly dry, hollow final, sealing his words. The wind eased dust, settling into a silver-gray glow. Overhead clouds tore, leaving a blade of light across the street like the last crescent of a dying moon. Hand in hand, Elias led Grace through the parted crowd. Their shadows stretched long across the red earth, bound together, unbroken. If you had been in that crowd, would you have stayed with the whisperers or stepped forward to stand beside Elias? Part 9. The moment of touch evening settled over the prairie in a wash of gray gold. After the morning standoff in town, Elias guided Midnight back toward the ranch. The horse's hooves struck slow against the damp earth, red dust rising in faint breaths before the wind carried it away as though the whole land itself was holding still with each step. Grace sat small in front of him, silent. Her tiny hand clutched the silver chain, her eyes fixed far off, though her heart was still knotted by the stares and whispers of the town. Elias could feel the tension in her small frame pressed against him. Lowering his head, he murmured, "We're home now. Here no one can touch you." The ranch came into view, the sheet metal roof catching the last of the evening light, the broken fence rattling against the wind. It was the same weathered sight it had always been, but now it stood like a wall of shelter. Midnight snorted, gave a soft whinny as if to say the long trail was done. Elias lifted Grace down, setting her gently on the porch. For a moment they lingered there, listening to the cottonwoods whisper in the wind, listening to the distant bellow of cattle stirred by a sudden gust. Out here, chaos was always waiting, but on this porch of old timber, Elias swore there would be peace. Night fell. In the wooden kitchen, the hearth glowed firelight, spilling soft and golden across the walls, pushing back the darkness that crept through the cracks. Rain began again, tapping slow on the tin roof, turning into a steady rhythm, a song the night seemed to breathe. Grace sat curled on a chair, Marion's half-finished wool scarf wrapped about her shoulders. Her eyes still carried the tremor of fear, but in their depths was the thin edge of trust. Before her sat a bowl of hot soup, steam rising. Across the table, Elias turned a spoon in his scarred hands, unsure how to begin. The wind moaned across the prairie. From far off came the flat crack of a stray rifle, someone target shooting out by the empty range. The sound pulled Elias back to the morning, to the jeers, the stares, the words meant to cut. He raised his eyes and found Grace watching him. Her dark gaze shimmered with firelight, bright and fragile as glass. He set the spoon down, his voice rough but gentle. "Grace." The child shivered. Elias drew in a breath and did something he had not done since the day he buried wife and son. He reached across the table and laid his hand over hers. At first she startled, then she stilled. Her gaze dropped to that calloused hand, one that had held guns, gripped reins, shoveled earth into graves, and now rested tenderly atop her own, saying, "What words could not? You are not alone." The fire in the hearth whispered softly, its golden light trembling across Grace's face. The child clutched the silver cross, then lifted her eyes and spoke, her voice barely more than breath. You won't leave me, like they said. Will you?" The question cut Elias deep, sharp as a blade sliding into his chest. He had lived his life beneath the weight of abandonment by the town, by their whispers, and by the merciless hand of memory. But never before had he heard a trembling child's voice lay its trust squarely upon his shoulders. He could not answer at once. His throat closed, his hand shook, and for the first time in years, tears welled, streaking down the weathered lines of his sunburnt face. He bent low and wrapped his arms around Grace. The child stiffened at first, then broke into sobs, burying her face against his chest. The small, uneven cries mingled with the rain tapping the tin roof, mingled with the lonely howl of prairie wind. Elias held her tighter, terrified that if he let go, she too would vanish as wife and child had before. For the first time in many winters, the ranch echoed with the sound of weeping, not only of grief but of healing. They stayed that way a long while, firelight flickering around them. At last, Grace lifted her tear-streaked face, eyes swollen but no longer filled with fear. She raised the cross in both hands, offering it forward. "Mother said, you'd keep it better than me." Elias's hands trembled as he reached, but then he shook his head, pushing it gently back into her grasp. "No, it belongs to you, belongs to both of you. Your mother and you. I can only keep it if you're here." Grace nodded, pressing the cross against her chest, then leaned her small body into his shoulder. He brushed a hand across her damp hair, the smell of rain dust and wild grass clinging to every strand so real it ached. Outside, the cattle stirred in the night wind, bellowing long and low before settling again. From the far range came the dry crack of rifles, cold as flint, reminding that the world beyond these walls still sharpened itself on danger. Yet here in this kitchen there was only the murmur of fire, the steady breath of a sleeping child, and the old man's heartbeat keeping time like a song half remembered. Night gave way to ash-colored dawn. The sky outside the window shifted to a bruised gray, heralding a new day. Elias still sat with Grace in his arms, one hand holding her close, the other resting on the chair, his eyes lost in the dying glow of the fire. Something had shifted within him. No longer only regret, no longer only loneliness, but acceptance that the past had sown him sorrow. Yes, but also left him this fragile seed of life to guard. Grace slept soundly against his chest, her breathing steady as the prairie breeze. Elias bent his head and whispered, "From this day, you don't run anymore." Outside, a single drop of dew fell from the eaves, scattering light as dawn crept in like a dying moon giving way to the sun. Elias tightened his arms, and for the first time in decades felt his heart at peace. The sun was not yet up, but in his chest, a new morning had already begun. If you had once lost everything, then were given a second chance to hold trust again. In your arms would you dare to open your heart as Elias did? Part 10. The House with Laughter. Dawn laid a wash of gold across the prairie. Morning light slid over the dew-wet hills, each drop shining like beads of glass scattered by a patient hand. The tin roof of the Ward Ranch caught the sun, and for the first time in many years, it didn't look dull or gray. It glimmered like an old mirror finely wiped clean. The morning wind carried the scent of fresh grass and a trace of smoke from the hearth. Far off, the cattle drifted toward the creek, bellowing in short bursts, their voices rising together like a chorus that welcomed the day. From the edge of town came the sharp crack of rifle practice, but now it no longer carried the weight of dread, only the steady drumbeat of life going on. Inside the cabin, Elias stirred the fire and set a pot of coffee to boil over the iron hook. The water whispered as it heated, blending with the clink of spoons and bowls. At the table, Grace sat with pink rising in her cheeks. She sipped soup, giggling when Midnight pushed his nose through the stall window, sniffing at the smell of bread toasting over the fire. That sound, the laughter of a child, filled a house that had known only silence. It seeped into the cracks of the timber, into every nail and joint, pushing out the ghosts that had long lingered there. Elias sat opposite, a quiet smile softening the hard lines of his face. Breakfast was plain potato soup, warmed bread, and black coffee. But for the first time in decades, the table was not empty. The scrape of spoons, the crunch of bread, the soft giggle of a girl all wove together into a song Elias thought he would never hear again. His eyes drifted to the empty chair across the table where Marion had once sat. For years, that chair was a wound. This morning, it was not pain, but memory carried forward in the presence of the child beside him. Grace sat with her legs swinging, her eyes bright as twin stars. "You cook good," Grace said shyly, her voice clear despite the timidity. "Mama told me, men out here only know how to shoot. But you can make soup." Elias let out a short, low laugh, rough, almost strange to his own ears. But it warmed the kitchen like sunlight. Grace laughed with him, her voice light and ringing, and in that sound the bridge was built between a past heavy with loss and a present beginning to hope. Outside, the wind carried a little dust down the trail, but it was no longer harsh. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a lone traveler rode past, hoofbeats, slow, unhurried. He glanced toward the ranch, caught the glow of firelight, heard faint laughter carried on the wind. He touched the brim of his hat and nodded, acknowledging what all the town would soon know. The Ward Ranch was no longer the house of silence. After breakfast, Elias led Grace out onto the porch. The sun had already climbed above the ridge, spilling golden light across the meadow still glistening with morning dew. Behind the house, the old cottonwoods swayed in the breeze, their wet leaves shimmering like 1,000 tiny mirrors. Grace ran across the damp grass, her small feet pattering as her laughter rang bright and clear across the yard. Midnight, faithful and solemn for so many years, suddenly let out a soft whinny, lowering his great head so the little girl could pat his mane. Elias stood motionless, watching. For the first time in so many years, the ranch no longer felt like a prison of memories. It felt alive again, alive with laughter, with the sound of hooves, with hope. Far off, the cattle shifted toward new pasture, their calls echoing like a hymn across the plains. A sudden gust swept through, stirring up a swirl of red dust like a miniature sandstorm. For an instant, the old storm memories clawed at Elias's chest. But then Grace's laughter rose above it, so pure, so bright, that it scattered the weight of the past. He understood in that moment the past no longer had absolute power. Elias walked to the barn and brought out an old weathered saddle. With steady care, he lifted Grace onto Midnight's back, keeping his hand firm on the reins. The child squealed with delight, clutching at the horse's mane with both hands. "Someday," Elias asked gently, his voice softer than it had been in years, "would you like to learn to ride?" Grace nodded eagerly, her smile as radiant as sunlight on still water. And in her shining eyes, Elias saw not the graves beneath the cottonwood, but a future. A child who might grow up on this ranch with the sound of hoofbeats, the breath of the prairie wind, and the warmth of a home. A new seed had been planted on land once called cursed. By evening, the ranch glowed in the honeyed light of sunset. Elias and Grace sat together at the table, sharing a simple supper. The sound of spoons against bowls mingled with the bright ring of Grace's laughter. The fire in the hearth cast a gentle light across the wooden walls, not the light of loneliness, but the glow of a home reborn. Elias looked around the old kitchen. Once these walls had felt narrow and heavy with silence. Tonight, they seemed wider, warmer. The empty chair across the table. Marion's chair was no longer only a wound, but a memory now carried forward by Grace's laughter. The Ward Ranch was no longer the house of silence. It was the house with a child's laughter. He reached across the table, clasping Grace's small hand in his. His voice lowered to a whisper, rough yet tender. "No one is ever too late to be loved again." Outside, the new moon hung silver over the ranch, its light pouring across the tin roof. Once that crescent had looked like an omen. Tonight it stood as witness, silent and eternal, to a new beginning. The echo of a dawn poured over the prairie like a golden blanket, stretching all the way to the far-off mountains. On the worn wooden porch, Elias Ward stood still. Beside him, Grace pressed close, her small hands gripping his, as if afraid that if she let go, the wind of the Wild West might carry him away. In Elias's hand was the silver cross. Once heavy as chains, it now felt weightless, as though memory and pain had both been released. He stepped inside, placed the cross upon the old pine altar darkened by years. Morning light streamed through the window, spilling across the silver face, turning it into a small lantern of faith. He tightened his grip on Grace's hand, his voice rough but steady. "From this day on, you don't just have a memory to hold on to. You have a home." The child nodded, dark eyes shimmering with tears, but a smile lifting at the corners of her lips. Elias bent down and for the first time pressed a trembling kiss onto her hair, a kiss that was both a promise and an apology sent to Marion somewhere beyond. Outside, the cattle bellowed across the plains, the town's gunshots echoed faintly, and someone's horse struck rhythm on the dusty trail. The west was still harsh, still thick with judgment. But inside this wooden house, a new life had begun, a ranch no longer built only of silence, but filled with the laughter of a child and memories reborn as hope. Elias lifted his eyes to the sky and whispered, "No one is ever too late to be loved again." The morning light stretched their shadows, one tall, one small, across the porch, running far into the endless prairie. Do you believe some encounters are destined to heal the past? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you were the rancher, would you have stayed or ridden away into the wild? Let me know in the comments.